It's funny, like, when I moved, people are like, oh, do you not miss London? And I'm like, really the opposite. Like, I don't know how to put up with it for 20 years,
But we used to do the leave on Friday evening,
Yeah, yeah.
drive to the Catskills,
Yeah.
leave on Sunday night,
Yeah.
go back to New York.
Yeah. Yeah.
We really did that for
Yeah. It kind of takes the joy out of it, doesn't it? Yeah.
with a dog that's like barking.
Okay. Good evening, everybody, and thank you all so much for coming. It's a real pleasure to be back together in person in Perugia. My name is Tom Trewinnard. I'm going to be moderating the conversation today. I'm joined by Fara Warner, Shirish Kulkarni, and Laura Oliver, three of the bright minds in impact in journalism. And I tried to title this a little bit provocatively. I see, there's an amazing program here, and when I looked at what category our session fell under, it's other topics, which I thought was quite nice. But we all become journalists for a reason, and hopefully today's discussion will be interesting and fruitful. Usually at this conference, there's time for question and answer at the end, and it's usually a very rich and interesting part of the conversation. We're not going to be able to do that today in the usual way, but we have set up a Slido so you can submit questions via the platform, and I will read them out and we can discuss them as a group. And I think that's been working pretty well for most of the sessions. So I don't know if we can leave this slide up for a few minutes so that people can just access the Slido and post some questions there, and I'll introduce those into the discussion as we go. So my name's Tom Trewinnard. I'm one of the co-founders of an organization called Fathm, and we are, sorry, could you keep the slide up, please? And we are a news lab and consultancy and agency, and we work with newsrooms and with organizations that work around newsrooms in support of newsrooms. And we work on a range of what we think are very interesting and challenging topics for the industry. One of which is, to my mind, is impact. And we've been doing some really fascinating work with Solutions Journalism Network over the past year or so. My first encounter with impact was as a program manager writing a proposal, and I didn't understand really what it meant. So I'm going to kick off with a question that we're just going to move down the line. I'm going to get each of your takes on this. Laura, why should journalists care about impact?
I knew you were going to come to me first. And as it's 6:30, I'm worried that it's getting to kind of the honesty hour where I'm just going to be very
Perfect.
candid.
Honesty appreciated.
So hi, first of all, I'm Laura, and I'm a freelance journalist based in the UK, and I'm very lucky to have worked with Tom and colleagues at Fathm and with Fara on a project looking at impact of solutions journalism reporting in the States. Why should journalists care about impact? You might rephrase the question as, why do you do your job if you don't care about impact? I think that all journalists do want to have impact through their work. That might be going back to kind of traditional values of educating or informing. It might be pushing for accountability or even suggesting change that your audience or readers can make. And I think whether that's direct or indirect impact, we are seeking that through our work. So I would say it's pretty crucial in my mind.
Shirish.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely echo Laura's thoughts. I mean, I suppose I quibble with the provocative nature of Tom's question because, like, hasn't every year been the year of impact? Even if we go back, even if we take the bare minimum for journalism as it's our job to inform people, right? That is an impact. But interestingly, we sort of never measure whether we've informed people, and that's the very bare minimum. I did some research around storytelling and what people wanted from journalism. I'm going to get the reading glasses out because I want to read this. The conception I came up with was something I call orientation, that journalism should be about orientation. And that is that journalism should help us understand the world, locate us in our environment, and enable us to meaningfully interact with it. Journalism should help us form views which are consistent with the needs and interests of ourselves, our families, and our communities. And that sounds really obvious, right, when you say it out loud. But look at the journalism which exists in the world. Like, how much of it actually does that? So I think, as Tom said, we all become, like, I think pretty much everyone here will become a journalist at some level to make the world a better place. I really hope so, and that's absolutely what I did. But the purpose and the practice of journalism have become so disentangled. You know, I've worked in mainstream media organisations 20 years. I worked at Sky News, worked at the BBC, I worked at IGN. Like, I never got to do any of that stuff. But actually, that's what journalism is. And so I think every year should have been, and certainly can be, the year of impact.
Last but not by no means least.
Oh, thank you. So I guess I'll continue on with this theme of why don't we think that we're having impact? We always have impact, whether it's intentional or not, whether it's conscious or not. In terms of what we may consider to be traditional journalism, right? I don't think any one of us got into this business so I could have more page views or more clicks or even more likes or even more social shares. That's not why we do this work. We have outsized impact because we amplify people's stories. And so we may, in fact, be having a negative impact on our communities because we're not, in fact, being intentional about the work that we do. So if we think about journalism and the way we do it, often we are very extractive. We're very transactional with people. We go into it asking for a quote instead of a story. We call ourselves, and I know there's this controversy right now of whether we're storytellers, and people are not really, our communities don't, it's like, who are you to tell my story? And I like more of the story gatherer, but I'm not even sure I like that. Where we come down at Solutions Journalism is, our mission is to transform journalism so that more people have access to news and information that helps them see and build a more sustainable and equitable future. So we really think about catalyzing communities, and I think we already have impact. So what is the difference if we are intentional about the impact versus unintentional and unconscious? When we all kind of know we're having impact, we just sometimes are unhappy with, in fact, the impact that we do have.
So we all came into the industry to have some impact. I think we're agreed on that. Is the room agreed on that? And we could, if we're not having impact, it's important to know that. If we're having a negative impact, it's important to know that. Why don't we, as an industry or as a community, have a good sense of the impact of our work? Is that fair to say? Mm-hmm. Is there something cultural or why don't we have a good sense of the impact of our work in general?
I think it's because we don't want to, because we are scared of what we'll find out. Because as Fara said, a lot of mainstream media's work is extractive and negative. Yeah, and as Fara says, we are having impact. The public broadcaster in the UK is doing straightforward transphobic content, but dressed up as journalism. So that is having an impact, and at some level they know, but actually they don't want to admit it, and so they don't want to go into understanding what that impact is. Because actually, if we measured it, if people were informed, we'd find out they weren't. And so actually we don't want to know. So I think that's why there's all this kind of fishing around the edges, picking at it, but actually it comes back to reimagining of journalism and what journalism is for, or like going back to what we started with journalism. So yeah, I think it's because we're too scared to find out.
I think there's some truth in that.
I would say as well is that we don't often have very good tools to truly measure impact. Most of the tools that we have right now are they're proxies for engagement. They're basically website metrics. They're telling me whether somebody came to my page, somebody did something. And even, a few years ago, people really got into time, time spent on page. That meant something, right? It's like they spent one more second on my page. That must mean something. I don't know whether it means anything or not. And so I think it also comes down to, one, I agree, we don't really want to know. And we also don't have particularly great measurement tools, although I think increasingly we can and should build those tools. But those are sort of my initial thoughts.
Laura, you've spent some time working on those tools with some really interesting newsrooms. Could you tell us a bit about what was the approach that you took to measuring impact with the Solutions Journalism Network?
Yeah, I mean, first thing I should say, it was a real privilege because part of our work was to spend time talking to small but powerful newsrooms across the US for this project, many of whom are deeply embedded in their communities. So what I found so interesting was that they think about impact quite a lot of the time, because whether that's they will encounter the community they are reporting on as soon as they leave their office or home office, they know people in the stories affecting, i.e. people like that person that they interviewed or that person that is affected, and they are surrounded by the lived experiences of their stories and their sources and their subjects. So they had a really good sense of actually how to define impact, which I think is also something that we really struggle with, and as Farah said, we've used proxies for before, and then that kind of, we trip ourselves up as journalists and media organisations. Anyway, you asked me how we did it. So we spent a lot of time, first of all, talking to these newsrooms, those that had never done this work before. There was also some work around kind of reassuring them that this wasn't going to be a big, heavy lifting project. And actually what they could do was through a series of very simple, structured audience surveys, focus groups or workshops, could fill in not only some measures of what impact their solutions reporting had, but also other questions they had about the audiences who were consuming their work. So we were saying, you know these things either innately or through your existing work about your audiences. What else would you like to know? And then specifically about these stories, so each of these newsrooms have been working with SJN on usually a series of solutions-based stories, reports. To talk to them about, so before you publish, after you publish, what action might you hope people take after reading this story or watching this story? What are those things that really matter to you and your newsroom that people do with this information? Like Shirish said, how will people use it to orientate themselves? And just kind of getting those newsrooms to think through that process, how they could make use of that data afterwards, how it would then help them make other editorial decisions, I think was really important. Some of the newsrooms we worked with as well already had, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit later, they'd already tried to establish, and I think this is really important, a kind of an open channel with their audience, whether that was through existing kind of, send us an email as feedback, or we do an annual survey of our readership, or we have one of the teams we work with ran regular, they called them listening circles, where they would literally invite their, not during the pandemic, of course, and they're still virtual, but, they would invite members of their audience and their readership to discuss certain stories or discuss the direction of certain stories. So I think we were trying to encourage newsrooms that hadn't worked in that way before as well to set up that kind of culture where they are essentially just more open to the feedback as well. So that was a very long answer to your question.
You touched on something there, and there's a question here that also gets to this. The question's around collaboration between journalists and civil society organizations, and are there ethical guidelines for journalists participating in this collaboration? And I think the gist of that question is civil society organizations will have a clear specific impact that they want to have. Is it controversial for us as journalists to think that we might want to have a specific impact beyond informing from our work? It's honesty hour.
I mean, this is where at Solutions Journalism we always get the A word at this point, advocacy. Are we advocating for a specific solution? Are we advocating for something to happen? And my answer is, as an investigative journalist, I always wanted, in business, the impact I wanted to have is somebody was going to lose their job. A CEO was going to step down. The stock was going to drop. That was the impact that I was going to have. So was I advocating for that company to sort of lose its CEO? I wouldn't have called that advocacy. I would have called that good journalism. So I may not call that good journalism now, as I've gotten older and wiser and more honest with myself. I think I think you can set up, to go back to that specific question, is that we do, at Solutions Journalism, we have what's called the Local Media Project, where we've worked with 15 collaboratives across the United States, which are collaborations between up to 15, 20, 25 news organizations in a specific city coming together. So Resolve Philly, we work with, we have new ones starting in Salt Lake City, Utah, Sacramento. What's interesting is that a number of them actually also have partnerships and engagement with civil social communities within those cities. So we work with libraries or a local grant-making organization. And what they start from is a very clear set of principles in the way that they are going to work with each other. So they start from a place of honesty and transparency and some agreements that I think are really important as we do make these connections with other civic organizations, because I think of journalism as a civic organization, that we can work with them, but we need to set up those guidelines really properly and come to agreement.
Isn't it funny how all the people throwing around the A word, advocacy, are old, straight, white, cis men, right? So what I hope is that 2022 will be the year we bin that ludicrous notion of journalistic objectivity, right? Because that's not objectivity, that's how do I maintain the status quo in which I have power and which I make the rules, right? So if people say it's advocacy, that I want Muslim people not to be harassed by the media. If people want to say it's advocacy to say, I want disabled people not to be disabled by society and the media, then fine, that's advocacy. But I don't have a problem with that if I'm going to work with civil society organisations to do that with data, with journalistic ethics applied to that, and only doing the story where I can prove that that is happening, sure. But I think there's lots of how do I maintain the status quo tied up in that, oh, that's advocacy, that's not journalism.
Sorry, I just wanted to add on that point. And equally, I mean, with the newsrooms we work with for this project, but other newsrooms around the world I've spoken to, when you are working, when you're rooted so much in your community or in your audience is a particular community, whether that's geographical or of interest, that separation and saying, I'm stepping back, actually, I'm objective and I'm not part of this, is just incredibly difficult as well. The issues you're reporting on are likely to be affecting you living there. I remember speaking to one of the great journalists working with SJN, who was reporting on affordable housing in the Rocky Mountain area. And she was saying, she was in her mid-20s and saying, this story deeply affects me and pretty much everyone I know as well. Not for a second did I think she was using this to, grind a personal axe. But you can't separate out these things so easily when you're so embedded in that local community in particular.
How does, Shirish, you've just started a big project, right? Or you just launched a big project, the People's...
the People's Newsroom.
People's Newsroom. How does thinking about impact from the outset of a project like that change how you work and what you're doing?
Yeah. I mean, I can talk about that, but I can also, so I work at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and recently on the People's Newsroom project. So I'll talk about that, a bit about that in a second, if that's okay. But in the wider Bureau's work, we really have embedded impact from the start. So we have a story memo when we first think about how we do a story, and impact is embedded in that from the very beginning. What is the aim of this, and how are we going to achieve that? And actually, it's product thinking, right, as well. Because actually, if you have a particular story, if you have a particular impact aim, then actually, maybe that would be better served by a podcast. Maybe that would be better served by a long read. Maybe that would be better served by a Twitter thread, frankly. Some of these things, we probably haven't got that far on the product thinking bit, but I think that's where we want to go. That actually, it drives the whole process. So, I think it also starts you thinking much more about things like solutions journalism, because actually, it can't just be, I'm going to get the bad guy, because actually that's not helpful to people. If we go back to that, how we're informing people, that's not the thing that's making the difference. And going back to, Farah's thing about getting the CEO, we had this kind of whole Partygate scandal in the UK about the government being at parties during lockdown, stuff like that. And it's like, some people would think, if Boris Johnson resigns tomorrow, I've had impact. But actually nothing changes, right? The policies don't change, the system doesn't change. So actually, we've started thinking, what's the systems change piece about this? If the CEO resigns and the deputy takes over, who was appointed by the CEO, that's not going to make a difference. So it's like, how do we get to the systems change piece which underlines that? And it's not the kind of thing that wins awards, which is also, I think, a false notion of impact for journalism organisations. Because, we have awards, and like the people who choose, the big awards in the UK, some of those people I wouldn't trust to choose my sandwich. So like, why should I judge all my impact on the basis of people I don't really trust to choose my sandwich? So it's like thinking about what's important, how are we changing things for the better?
One thing about the CEO losing his job or her job is then the next story is how much money they're going to walk away with from that company, right? Their consolation prize for losing their job isn't that they don't have a job and they lose their house and their car. They get millions of dollars to go do their work someplace else. So even the impact that I've had is really not, or what I thought was the impact is completely, as you said, irrelevant at that point.
Farah, in prep, you had a nice example of a project that had started with quite a clear definition of impact and had changed how it was approaching I think it was the election coverage in North Carolina.
Oh, yeah, thank you. So at Solutions Journalism, we work with thousands of journalists, hundreds of newsrooms, and one of my favorite, and this goes to sort of the question around advocacy, right, is, so in the United States, there's a great newsroom called the Daily Tar Heel, which is actually the student-run newspaper for the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Really strong journalism program, a great newspaper. And in 2020, they decided that they were going to be intentional about the impact that they were going to have for the 2020 elections. So instead of doing their traditional elections coverage, which was the horse race and the politicians coming in and them interviewing them and all of that, they said, well, what impact what outcome would we like? And this is systems change, right? Is what outcome would we expect from our work? And the outcome that they put in mind was that more young people would vote in North Carolina in 2020. That's not advocacy. That's just, we know that it was a solution to a problem. So in some ways it was a bit meta, is they really felt like their audience, which were young people, really needed, again, in the public interest and public knowledge, to better understand what does it mean to vote. So they completely changed what they were doing. They then went to their audience and asked them what would help you. So they first talked to people before writing about them. Crazy idea, right? You'd actually go talk to people before you write about them. Instead of being like, if you could say this quote this way, that would be awesome. And they learned that what was really important were like voting guides. Simple, easy to understand, easy to use on sort of the platforms of the politicians, how to vote, where to vote, why voting mattered. And this is a group, what I love about this is a group of college journalists, right? And I think they really showed traditional journalism what could happen. And after that, they were then able to go back and measure the impact of their work. And on the UNC campus, there was an increase in the number of people voting, and North Carolina, I believe, did see an increase in the number of young people voting. So this is also where impact becomes really hard to measure. Was it correlation or causation? And so that all becomes difficult. But what I think was interesting for them was something that they could measure, was the impact on themselves. They felt better coming out of the election than they had done in the past in covering election. They didn't, it was just, this is the work that they wanted to do. And so they decided that they would never cover elections from kind of the horse race politician's point of view.
I think that the internal effect of measuring impact is something that I've noticed in our work with your newsrooms, where a quite simple survey at the end of an article that says, what did you do after you read this? Did you take an action? Did you speak to a friend about this topic? Did you increase a donation to a food bank or something like that? What's been really interesting to me has been seeing the journalists who wrote the articles' response to seeing this feedback on their work, because I think we've got this. The traditional model is you sort of cast out you might work for months on a report, and then it's gone and it's into the ether and you don't know what's happened to it. But we had a really interesting experience with a young reporter in Santa Fe, who she was really overwhelmed and touched by the fact that people who had read her article had decided to do a graduate degree in this topic, or they joined an organization, or they'd increased their political participation somehow, and that the internal value of that impact measurement exercise, even though it was, I don't think it was a huge sample. There was maybe 100, 200 responses to that survey, 300 responses to that survey. This was an amazing case of an alt weekly, which in the US is kind of like a newspaper that comes out once a week and is distributed often in smaller cities. But they'd printed a link to the online survey, and they had 300 people who'd put that link into their computers to go and tell the reporter and tell the newsroom what they thought about this work. We have some interesting questions coming through. I think this is a bit of a loaded question, but I'm going to read it as is. How much of the pressure or demand to demonstrate impact and metrics is coming from philanthropy and the organizations that fund journalism?
I mean, I think this is interesting because you prefaced this discussion with your first encounter with impact was filling in a grant application or a program application. And I would say that was probably my first encounter with this word in journalism, impact, which was reporting back. I was the journalist in the newsroom at the time who knew how to work the analytics suite, so people would come to me to ask me these questions, and then I'd say, be careful how you interpret it, though, and then they'd just take the biggest number. But yeah, I think in my personal experience, it's not been pressure so much, but it is, as Farah was saying, really getting this agreement right of what we are talking about when we measure this, and where where, frankly, the tools or the metrics aren't up to scratch, because there are many things that are very difficult to capture about this. So the best experience I've had is where I've been able to talk to whether it's a funder or a partner, and we've been able to establish kind of how we're going to report back this impact and the sort of story around it, so that we do capture all those things that aren't, can't be reduced to a figure or a very kind of simple metric. And some of that, that example you included of the report and the feedback we got there, that stuff has to go in too, and it's very hard to capture. But I'm speaking from a point of view when we have others on the panel who have worked with foundations much more.
I mean, what I'd say is that in a sense it gets back to a kind of almost a question that comes before that, which is, so there's an Einstein quote, isn't there, that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And to me, that is problematic. That's a problematic aspect of kind of the way impact then gets put through some kind of analytics. Because, like, to give an example that I find every day is, like, I work a lot with marginalised, underserved communities. And I always say the existential problem journalism is facing is trust, right? That is the problem. If we don't sort that out, then we won't have an industry in 5 years, because people have lost hate the concept of journalism, right? And so I say, to build trust, we just need to do trustworthy things. And again, it sounds simple, but we don't do it. And some of that trustworthy stuff is showing up for people, and showing up for people in communities when there's nothing in it for us. Helping out at food bank, doing stuff, showing up day after day, month after month, week after week. That's how you build trust, and there's no getting away from that. You don't build trust tomorrow. But if I show up for someone tomorrow and next week and next month, I don't want to ask them, oh, has that improved your trust in me because I showed up? Because actually, instantly you lose the trust. Because it's like, there was something in it. No, there wasn't. I just wanted to do it because it was the right thing to do. So actually, sometimes counting gets in the way of the impact. So you get like a perverse effect. So I think we can't lose sight of, actually, we just sometimes need to do stuff because it's the right thing to do.
I think it's a really great question in terms of how is philanthropy, what effect is philanthropy having on journalism? Because, that is what is asked for in grant proposals. How will you measure the impact of your work? We face that at Solutions Journalism Network all the time. What I would say is that, again, it comes even before the grant proposal, is that what is the impact that you want to have on your community? And I say on your community. This isn't some other sort of, community out there that I'm not a part of. Like the Santa Fe journalist, she lives in the community. She can't, she's one of those people who can't afford to live in that community. And so this sort of disconnect, Shirish, as you said, is, the myth of objectivity is because it is just wrong. What I would say is we have to be careful that we aren't twisting ourselves into knots for our funders, but we start with what is the impact we want to have, and be very clear with funders that this isn't the impact you want, it's the impact we want and that our community needs from us. But I think it's a really important question, because one of the reasons that we, at Solutions Journalism want to support newsrooms in building what I call the impact muscle is that we see that it is needed for them. They need this skill when they're going into grant proposals, and so I'm hoping that we're helping them do it in the best way possible for them, so they don't end up getting in that sort of like, I'm just going to measure whatever I think the funder thinks I should measure, and then it has absolutely nothing to do with their community.
I would second that. It's when you're in the grant writing phase, your incentive is to try and please the fund. You want to tell them what they want to hear so that you can get the money to do the thing you want to do. So if you don't have a clear view of that impact muscle and you're not grounded in the community level impact that you want to have and hold really tight to that, and that's not an easy thing to do always when there's money on the table and you're trying to navigate that. But from the question, what I kind of got was that there was the pressure demand. I think the case that I'd like to make with the panel, and I think it's shared, is that the pressure and demand to better understand the impact of our work should be coming from us, and that this should not be about funders primarily. It should be how do we know that the work that we're doing is helping the people that we're trying to help? And if it's not, then what do we need to do to change that? And if it is, how can we share those learnings with other people so that they can take those ideas elsewhere? There's a couple of other questions here. One is to Shirish, which is we've spoken about kind of system change as a key impact measure. How do you situate that in countries or contexts where the act of journalism is repressed, persecuted? How should journalists in those places think about this?
Right. So I'm not going to speak for those journalists because I don't work in those situations, and I have the privilege of not working. So I'm not going to give anyone advice on how best to do their job in that situation. But I guess what I would say is that ultimately you can have, it's thinking about what can keep you safe in that situation and what you ultimately want to achieve. Because if you're still doing the journalism, you want to achieve something, right? I'm not going to say you should do X, Y, and Z, which isn't going to keep you safe, but actually you still want to do the journalism. So what is the kind of journalism you want to do in that scenario? What are the things you think can help? It doesn't have to be systems change. Yeah, like I would love there to be more systems changes. It doesn't have to be systems change or regime change or whatever, but it can be making change and just changing the conversation, because actually there's an audience for that work, right? And so changing the context of the conversation can be an impact. And and I think ultimately it comes down to what we talked about from the beginning. It's like, are we informing people? Because that's got to be the root of journalism. Are we informing people? Are we helping orientate themselves? And how are we, as long as we can do that safely?
There are some good questions here about. There's one around. Can we give some examples of impact frameworks, or what metrics can we use to show impact? Not everything counts that can be counted.
I have to write it down.
But what are some useful metrics, or how do we get to the point of designing a useful metric?
So, I would say in my experience and having worked with the newsrooms that we worked with, we were selective. We did not discount, I'm going to get these wrong now, quantitative and qualitative. It's late in the day, please forgive me. But we kind of encouraged the newsrooms when we were structuring these surveys. So essentially, we were asking many of the newsrooms. They could do one before they published the stories and one after, so they could compare the results. They could do one as they were publishing the stories to get this feedback. But to be really selective and say, look, there are 404 things we could try and measure here. Let us pick the most important ones to this particular project or story. And ideally, those should align with what your newsroom wants to do. Because, otherwise you will measure something and then you go, great, well, we've learned that. What do we do with that now? It needs to contribute to a greater discussion or a greater mission for your organisation, or however you want to phrase it. Mission might be the wrong word. But so for those newsrooms, we were saying, okay, we've got some gaps in knowledge of your audience. Like you might know a little bit about them, but you want to understand the more of the demographics of this audience who are reading these stories. And then we've got some qualitative stuff that we want to understand, again, these actions that they've taken. But again, saying do not give them a menu of like 100 things they could have done. Think about what is the afterlife of the story and what is likely to have happened, what is possible, what is realistic, and ask them to measure that. I'm not going to talk about indices and frameworks because my job is focusing more on the sort of editorial side of it. But I'm very happy if anyone else would like to.
Well, I wanted to pick up on that because, like, I'm a data guy, right? In my research, I 100% use quantitative data because that's how you prove that, you can do journalism in better ways using this. However, in impact, I think, and it goes back to the funder question as well, it's too easy to slip just into just doing quantitative stuff. I think we should not ignore qualitative data in those situations where we get a richer sense of, like what we talked about, the personal impact, both on the people and communities we're serving, but on the journalists themselves. And I think it also gets back to a little bit of the product thinking stuff, because ultimately the thing you want to measure is the thing that's going to help you achieve your kind of North Star metric for your organization. And not many organizations have a North Star metric. So, I can say this because I've said it to people in the Bureau very openly. It's like, what is my North Star metric? Because I work 2 days a week at the Bureau. I have 20 things to do. Like, how do I choose what are the things I prioritize out of that 20 things? Because I need a North Star metric to aim at. And, someone said, oh, you can look at our mission statement. And I was like, there's 5 different metrics contained in that mission statement. That's not helping me at all. So, I don't necessarily agree with ProPublica's thing about, it's like bills passed or amendments passed or everything. But at least there's a North Star metric. So they know this. If I do this, that's going to get me to my North Star metric. Whereas if I do this, that's not really going to have any impact on that. So having a goal, having something to aim at is really important, because then you're not measuring 50 things. You might just get away with measuring one thing because that's getting you to your North Star metric.
Farah, what's Solutions Journalism Network's North Star metric?
I'm going to back in. I'm still here. I'm going to use an example because I think it's one of my most favorite. Is the Montana Free Press is one of the newsrooms that we work with in a climate-focused initiative. Montana Free Press is based in Montana, obviously, and they basically cover the entire state. They had not done any impact measurement, even though they knew that they needed to do it. And one of the things that I find can be true with a lot of the newsrooms that we work with is that the reason that they don't do impact measurement is they think they need a North Star to start. And what was so cool about Montana Free Press is they just decided, we don't know what we don't know, so why don't we just put a survey at the end of one of our stories? We're just going to do that. That was it. And from there, what was interesting is they now do have an impact muscle built. They are building out their North Star. But for them to have tried to define a North Star before they'd ever asked any questions was virtually impossible. And I think that that's what, a lot of journalists and small news organizations in particular literally freeze when you say impact. It's like they're going to have to build a thing, and it's going to have to be big, and they're going to have to measure stuff and buy things, and you could just really put like a Google survey question at the end of your story. And what happened with the Montana Free Press is they got 400 responses, more than 400 responses to this survey, which happened to come at the end of a 5,000-word story on regenerative agriculture in the Golden Triangle of Montana. What was beautiful about it is it was also one of the most beautifully written pieces I've ever read, and I was fortunate to see it before it was published. The writer she asked if I would read it, and so from there they kind of had a sense of like, who's our audience, and then they put a survey on their next story. And the next story, they decided, maybe we could build a little bit of like audience engagement here, and maybe we could even ask our subscribers to donate, like to send us money. And so they actually did a call saying, we would love to keep doing these stories, but this journalism costs money. And so they set a goal of $2,500. It's not very much, but it was going to support Emily's work. They ended up getting about $4,000 worth of, $4,000 in donations, and then they had a couple of funders who just doubled that for them. So they ended up with $8,000 so that Emily could actually keep doing her work. And what was great about it is that it didn't come as one of those sort of just out of the blue asks for money, which was, you know, journalism matters, so pay us some money. It actually was connected to stories that the audience was already invested in, because a lot of their readers, they found, were the families of farmers. And they cared about this work, and they really cared about, and what was different also, of course, about the work is it was solutions journalism. It was about a response to a problem, and these farmers and ranchers felt like they were seen and heard by Emily in her work. So I would say that it first starts with the journalism. You can't have impact if you don't do good journalism. So.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to add on that because it sort of goes back nicely to what Shirish was saying earlier. I have completely seen this, what you say, like this kind of almost like fear of, well, we don't know what we don't know, or, you know, for so long our North Star metric might have been, or our mission might have been, the audience need to update me, you know, just keep me updated. And that was what we did as journalists for such a long time. And not to cross the streams too much, but someone who can't be at this festival, unfortunately, Dmitry Shishkin, has taught me so much about trying to understand different needs of our audiences. And yeah, just doing that simple survey to understand the other types of information that people respond to, find useful, can have agency, can maybe even have some hope as well about what's going on around them. I just think it's so important, because I think for a long time we've been told that our mission as journalists is update me, not even keep me orientated, just give you the next and the next and the next.
There's a great question here, which I think is probably something we've all encountered. What is your advice for addressing the opinion of journalists who believe that impact can't be measured, or that at best it can be loosely assessed? How do we convince the doubters?
First we go for a long coffee, is usually what happens. For me, the best kind of example of this is both in impact work, but I've spent a lot of my career working in newsrooms, trying to find other ways to involve our audience, whether that's in our journalism, in our membership programs, in events. And the same kind of doubts, I think, appear there too. You know, why am we having these conversations, or what if I get negative feedback, or, you know, those kind of things. And for me, the most useful way of convincing people has been to talk about the example you gave earlier, for example, of our journalist at in Santa Fe, when she read that feedback. And just to find a specific kind of project that we could work on together, to say, let's just try it, we're going to try something small. I think this will help your work because, or I think this will help this story travel further or reach this audience, and actually this is the audience we want it to get to. And I find often if I'm talking to an individual journalist, I think it's different if we're talking about like convincing senior leadership, but with an individual journalist who might be concerned or confused, it might be because the sort of phrase impact measures or impact metrics feels very, you know, it doesn't feel concrete, doesn't, you know, it's not something they've come across before, and so it gets their heckles up with. Whereas if I can put it through the lens of how is this going to help the journalism, how is this going to help it reach the right people, how is it going to make this have an afterlife, a more powerful story, then that's great. But that tactic may not work with senior leadership, if anyone has advice on that front.
Well, I suppose on that I would just add that, yeah, totally, like, impact measurement sounds like the thing when they send a management consultant into your newsroom, and then like 15 people disappear the next week, right? So people get scared about it, right? But actually, I've had that conversation, and it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. It's kind of, I say to them, why did you become a journalist? And it's like, because I wanted to do this, this, and this. I was like, that's impact, right? That's why you became a journalist, is to make impact. And it's not some weird thing over here. What did you want to happen? Yeah, what's the thing which makes you happy? As we're talking about, the individual journalist. What's the thing that you're proudest of in your journalism? That's all impact, right? And so it's actually about, in a way, we shouldn't have to do this. It's selling back to people the image they have of themselves. And that's super easy, actually, in many ways, because people generally, I'm probably a bad example, people generally like themselves. And so, yeah, they want to do the thing that makes them happy. So actually, yeah, I haven't got a thing for the senior management, but I have got a thing for the individual journalist.
Can you read the question again? Just to remind.
What would be your advice for addressing the opinion of journalists who believe that impact can't be measured, or that at best it's assessed very loosely?
That's a good question. I think actually it can be assessed. We spend, there's a group of people inside Solutions Journalism that work on a quarterly impact report. And it basically is like our investigative unit. So we get a lot of impact. We ask for impact from many of our grant recipients, and we take all of those in. And oftentimes they're just very there's stories that need to be reported out. But we are able to, on a quarterly basis, generally come up with and investigate and report on anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 examples of very clear impact. Is it easy? No. Does it take a lot of time? Yes. But it's important work. Impact is also something that you may not see the impact of your work for years to come. So for me, it is a little squishy, right? Which is why we love our proxies. It's why we love our impressions and our clicks and our page views, because we can say, look at that, time spent. It's okay if something isn't perfect. It's okay if we can't see it immediately. Shirish, back to your points about we continue to be dominated in traditional media by a white, male, cis, wealthy group of people who, in a white supremacist culture, it has to be perfect. It's urgent. It has to be done yesterday. It has to be all these things, and it doesn't have to be all those things. So what I would love is for us to accept that we have to do more of this work. And for me, what I would love is if in 10 years I return to Emily and the impact of her work is that regenerative agriculture is the norm in Montana. It is not an outlier. And if she keeps doing this work and covering this work and covering the work of farmers who do this, then that is an amazing response to the climate crisis. Because if they don't do this, they will no longer exist as farmers. And they will no longer grow the wheat that we need to keep ourselves alive. So that is where I think impact is so important.
Yeah, I think that the idea of a kind of perfect, clear, fully robust measure of impact, or of anything really, it's so appealing because the certainty and the clarity of it. We all want that, but in reality, everybody's making decisions all the time about a million things every day based on the best data that you can pull together in a given moment, right? So I think we need to resist. I think we saw some of this in some of the governmental responses to the pandemic. They were waiting for the science to be clear, but they couldn't. It wasn't something that could be measured in real time, and so they were delaying really important decisions. Meanwhile, the virus was spreading, and disastrous consequences in the UK and elsewhere. So I think we need to get away from the idea that there is as Shirish said, that the North Star metric doesn't have to be the perfect thing. The purpose of the North Star is to guide. So we need to just find out what are our guides and what are the windows that we want into the what's happening with our work. We've got time just for a couple more questions here. Are there any resources or tools that we can share or methodologies for impact measurement in journalism?
We at Fathm have some resources that we'd be happy to share. I was just going to go back to Farah's point earlier as well about it could be very simple tools that could help you. So I've worked with organisations actually more in the NGO space talking about impact, but where two things. Number one, we did not want one person in the team to have to own impact measures so that they were the only person that understood these things and how they were measured, because then you get into trouble with, you know, the CEO comes down and they're not aware of it, or they don't understand, and people start kind of filling in the gaps in the data and the narrative. The other thing is we decided, as Shirish was saying, you know, actually for this project that we were working on, the three most important impacts we could have were these three things. And our main way of measuring was to assess through qual and quant data, but are we getting nearer that or are we further away? And of those things where we're getting nearer, is that because of work we've been doing? Is that because of external factors? And vice versa. You know, are we pulling up, and is that something out of our control? Is that a change in the economy, a change in policy? And we tracked those things in meetings and on a simple spreadsheet. Like, it wasn't, you know, so it was robust because everyone was discussing these agreed kind of impacts that we wanted to have, and everyone was very clear what those things meant because we discussed it, but we weren't creating a very kind of, you know, convoluted or kind of impenetrable formula for it. But yeah, we have some lovely resources at Fathm that we'd be very happy to share. There are also, and excuse me, the names escape me, but I will tweet them later, newsrooms that have built their own kind of impact trackers as well. And some of the best of those are honestly the simplest for me, because they give you a clear sense of why they're using them and how they might use them and how much time it takes them to do it as well. Because as Farah was saying, you know, this work does take time. So I'm happy to share some things afterwards that will be clickable.
I would agree with Laura that you know, keep it simple. One of the things that I always worry about people is that they'll get so obsessed with the tool that they'll forget why they're actually doing the thing. So they're like, I've got my dashboard and I've, you know, the real-time analytics and everything, and you're like, I don't know what this means. It looks pretty, and for the CEO, it's probably like, wow, pretty colors and everything. But I think oftentimes a simple spreadsheet is a pretty, like, you could do it in Airtable. In fact, some of the best story trackers that newsrooms have built are built in Airtable. So my advice is not what is the right tool. It's just don't fall in love with a tool. Fall in love with impact, and it's going to be my quote.
Yeah, I completely endorse that, because I think, and this is a kind of broader thing, I think sometimes we outsource the journalism to the tools, and it's like we can fix everything by having a tool for it. So it's like this industry around verification in journalism, and it's like, I'm not sure, because I don't think people are falling for deep fakes. I think they're falling for the things that elected politicians are saying out loud, right? So we don't want to look at the product and say, well, why do we always go to that politician for a quote when we know that what they're going to say is going to be a lie, when we don't necessarily have to. So we're sort of outsourcing our critical thinking to a tool. So we get back to, what's the thing you're trying to achieve? And like, what's the best way for me to measure that? And just do it in like a simple spreadsheet or a bit of qualitative data. Yeah, so it's keep it simple.
I think we're at time here, but I would just love to close. I think we're all clearly very passionate about impact. We hope you are too. Let's be evangelists for falling in love with impact and better understanding whether we're meeting the needs of the communities that we're trying to serve. Thank you to the panelists, and thank you all for coming.
And thank you, Tom, for being a great moderator.
I mean, I was so tired that it was like I'd drunk. So it's like, go well. Thank you. Yeah.
Thoughtful.
Hopefully next year they'll actually have a tag.
That's so
Yeah,
funny.
yeah,
I
yeah.
hadn't realised we were under other. That's so funny.